Imagine, if you will, the city of Helsinki in the dead of winter, 1970. On the surface, it looks like any other vibrant Western capital. The neon lights reflect off the snow. Teenagers in denim jeans drink Coca-Cola and listen to the Rolling Stones. Shop windows are filled with American appliances, and the economy is booming. To an outsider, this looks like the triumph of capitalism. But scratch the surface, and you find the silence. In the newsrooms of Helsinki's biggest papers, editors are sweating over every headline, terrified of printing a single word that might offend the neighbor to the east. In the government palace, the president isn't chosen by the voters alone, but by a silent nod from the Kremlin. And in the shipyards, thousands of workers are building massive icebreakers around the clock, not for profit, but to satisfy an insatiable debt. This is the paradox of Finland. While the rest of Europe was divided by an iron curtain, black and white, east and west, Finland existed in the gray. They were the only nation in history to fight the Soviet Union, lose, and yet survive. They didn't become a satellite state like Poland or Hungary. There were no Soviet tanks patrolling the streets of Helsinki. But this freedom came with a price tag. A price paid not in blood, but in steel, ships, and silence. For 40 years, Finland lived in a state of armed neutrality, sleeping with a pistol under the pillow while forcing a smile for the bear in the room. They invented a new kind of warfare, the economic Cold War. It was a strategy where sovereignty wasn't defended by armies, but by trade agreements, where independence was bought on an installment plan, month by month, shipment by shipment. Historians call it Finlandization, a term often used as an insult for cowardice. But was it? Or was it the most brilliant, high-stakes geopolitical gamble of the 20th century? Today, we are going to open the ledger of this dangerous transaction. We will see how a small nation let a superpower wrap its tentacles around their economy, only to use those same tentacles to pull themselves into the modern world. This is the story of how Finland survived the Soviet Union, by letting the Soviet Union think it owned them. The year was 1944. The guns of World War II had fallen silent, but for Finland, the danger was just beginning. They stood alone. The British and Americans had made it clear Finland was in the Soviet sphere of influence. No cavalry was coming to save them. The Finnish leadership, led by the pragmatic President Paasikivi, looked at the map and realized a terrifying truth. Geography is destiny. You can change your laws, you can change your government, but you cannot change your neighbors. Finland had two choices. Option A was to continue the fight, which would inevitably lead to a Soviet occupation, turning Helsinki into another gray, repressive satellite like Tallinn or Riga. Option B was to surrender their pride to save their existence. They chose option B. They called it realism. The rest of the world called it submission. But why did the Soviet Union agree to this? Why didn't Stalin just roll his tanks across the border and finish the job? It wasn't out of kindness. It was a cold, hard calculation. Stalin looked at Finland and saw a poisoned pill. Occupying Finland would require hundreds of thousands of troops to suppress a population that had already proven to be deadly winter warriors. It would be expensive, bloody, and distracting. Instead, Moscow devised a more profitable solution. If they couldn't own Finland politically, they would own them economically. The Kremlin presented Finland with a reparations bill that was designed to break them. $300 million worth of goods calculated at pre-war prices. But here was the catch. The Soviets didn't want cash. They didn't want the timber and paper that Finland actually produced. They demanded ships, locomotives, cables, and heavy machinery. This was an impossible demand. Finland was an agrarian society of farmers and lumberjacks. They didn't have the factories to build these things. And that was exactly the point. To pay this blood tax, Finland was forced to fundamentally restructure its entire society. They had to build a massive heavy industry sector from scratch, overnight, exclusively to serve the Soviet Union. The Soviets weren't just asking for money, they were engineering a dependency. They were turning the Finnish economy into a custom-made engine that could only run on Soviet fuel. The trap was set. Finland would remain a sovereign democracy on paper, but its factories, its workers, and its livelihood were now chained to the whims of Moscow. The shooting war was over. The reparations trap had begun. By 1952, the miracle happened. The last trainload of reparations crossed the border. Finland had paid its debt in full. In a normal world, this would be the moment Finland walked away. But the Soviet Union had anticipated this. They had not spent years forcing Finland to build massive shipyards and factories just to let them close down. The Kremlin knew that thousands of Finnish workers now relied on heavy industry for their paychecks. If the orders stopped, the Finnish economy would collapse. So, Moscow made an offer Helsinki couldn't refuse. Keep building. We will keep buying. This birthed the Bilateral Clearing Trade System. It was a unique economic ecosystem that existed outside the laws of global capitalism. No dollars, pounds, or rubles ever changed hands. Instead, everything was recorded in a central ledger. Here is how the machine worked. Finland sent icebreakers, paper machines, and cables east. The Soviet Union sent crude oil, natural gas, and raw timber west. Every year, the accounts had to balance. It seemed like a dream deal for Finnish captains of industry. They didn't have to worry about marketing, quality competition, or global recessions. They had a guaranteed buyer who took everything they produced. It was risk-free capitalism. But in reality, it was a narcotic. Finland became addicted to Soviet trade. The shipyards of Turku and Helsinki were churning out vessels specifically designed for Soviet ports. They were useless to Western buyers. Finland had built a monopsony, a market with only one customer. And there was a darker layer to this transaction: technology laundering. The Soviet Union was starving for Western technology but was blocked by embargoes. Finland became the back door. Finnish companies would import advanced electronics and precision tools from Germany or the US, integrate them into the ships or machinery, and then export the finished product to the USSR. Finland became the Soviet Union's window to the West, and the Soviet Union became Finland's life support system. The legal padlock on these golden handcuffs was the WWII Treaty, the Agreement of Friendship, Cooperation, and Mutual Assistance. It codified the relationship. Finland would stay neutral, but if anyone threatened Russia, Finland was obligated to fight. The trap was now perfect. The economy was hooked on Soviet oil, the military was bound by treaty, and the factories were built to serve a single master. Moscow didn't need to occupy Finland. They had effectively rented the entire country. By the late 1950s, the Finnish people began to mistake their economic stability for political freedom. They grew confident. In 1958, they made a decision that would test the limits of their leash. Following a parliamentary election, a new government was formed in Helsinki, led by Carl August Fagerholm. It was a broad coalition that included conservatives and social democrats, but conspicuously excluded the communists. To the West, this was normal democracy at work. To Moscow, it was an act of defiance. The Kremlin didn't issue a public ultimatum. They didn't mobilize the Red Army on the border. They simply stopped answering the phone. The Soviet ambassador in Helsinki packed his bags and returned to Moscow without explanation. Then the trade delegation canceled their scheduled meetings. But the real blow came at the shipyards and factories. The massive orders for icebreakers and industrial machinery, the lifeblood of the Finnish economy, were suddenly put on hold. This period became known in Finnish history as the Night Frost. It was a terrifying demonstration of the economic weapon. The Kremlin didn't need to fire a single shot to destabilize the country. They just had to close the ledger. As the weeks dragged on, panic set in. The metal industry faced mass layoffs. The farmers who relied on selling produce to Leningrad saw their markets vanish. The ice of the Saimaa Canal, Finland's export artery through Soviet territory, seemed to freeze thicker than usual. The message was deafeningly loud. You can have your democracy, but you cannot eat your ballot papers. Under this suffocating economic pressure, the Fagerholm government collapsed. It resigned not because of a vote of no confidence in parliament, but because of the silence from Moscow. From the ashes of this crisis rose a figure who would dominate Finland for the next quarter century: Urho Kekkonen. Kekkonen understood the game better than anyone. He was the only man the Kremlin trusted. He flew to Leningrad, shared a sauna and vodka with Nikita Khrushchev, and suddenly the night frost thawed. The trade resumed. The factories hummed back to life. But the lesson had been burned into the national psyche. The Finns realized that their prosperity was entirely conditional. This birthed the era of self-censorship. Newspapers stopped publishing cartoons critical of the USSR. Publishers rejected books by Soviet dissidents like Solzhenitsyn. It wasn't the KGB forcing them to do it. The Finns were doing it themselves to keep the trade routes open. The night frost proved that the structural trap was inescapable. Finland had retained its flag and its borders, but its soul was now mortgaged to the east. The golden handcuffs were locked tight, and Urho Kekkonen held the only key. For 30 years, the system hummed along. Presidents changed, generations passed, but the clearing trade remained the bedrock of Finnish life. It felt permanent, immutable, like the granite of the Helsinki coastline. But in 1991, the impossible happened. The Soviet Union didn't just decline, it evaporated. On Christmas Day, the hammer and sickle was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time. For the world, this was a moment of geopolitical triumph. For Finland, it was an economic heart attack. Overnight, Finland's biggest customer, the entity that bought nearly 20% of everything the country produced, ceased to exist. The clearing account ledger, which held billions in theoretical value, instantly became worthless paper. The Soviet state-owned enterprises that had guaranteed orders for decades simply stopped answering their phones. There was no one left to pay the bills. The result was catastrophic. Finland plunged into a depression deeper than the one in the 1930s. The structural weakness of the golden cage was suddenly exposed. For decades, Finnish industries had gotten fat and lazy. They had been building mediocre products for a Soviet market that demanded quantity, not quality. They didn't know how to market to the West. They didn't know how to compete with Germany or Japan. Why would they? They never had to. Factories went bankrupt by the hundreds. Unemployment skyrocketed from 3% to nearly 20% in just a few years. The banking sector imploded. The Soviet Trade Department, once the most prestigious job in Helsinki, became a graveyard of careers. The nation was left naked in the freezing cold. The special relationship was gone. The cheap oil stopped flowing. The special status that made them unique was now a liability. Finland was forced to look in the mirror. The realism that had saved them in 1944 had turned into a trap by 1991. They had mortgaged their future to a dying empire, and now the foreclosure notice had arrived. But in the ashes of this economic fire, something unexpected began to stir. With the heavy industry and textile mills decimating, the country had no choice but to pivot. The engineers and scientists who had spent years laundering Western tech for the Soviets were now free to innovate for themselves. The collapse of the old world didn't kill Finland. It forced them to reinvent themselves. The era of the icebreaker was over. The era of the mobile phone was about to begin.
If you walk through Helsinki today, the ghosts of the night frost seem like ancient history. Finland is now a member of NATO. It is consistently ranked as the happiest country on earth. The rusted shipyards that once slaved away for Stalin have been transformed into hubs for high-tech innovation. So, when we close the ledger on this 50-year economic Cold War, who actually won? On the surface, the Soviet Union got what it wanted. For half a century, they neutralized a dangerous neighbor without firing a shot. They extracted billions in goods and forced a proud democracy to bow its head in silence. They proved that you don't need to occupy a country with soldiers if you can occupy its order books. But look closer, and you see the ultimate irony. The golden handcuffs that were meant to enslave Finland actually made it stronger. By forcing an agrarian nation to rapidly industrialize to pay war reparations, the Soviet Union inadvertently built the engine of its own obsolescence. The engineers trained to build complex icebreakers and communication cables for the Red Army eventually took those skills and built Nokia. The pressure that was designed to crush them instead turned them into diamonds. While the rest of Eastern Europe was frozen in time behind the Iron Curtain, their economies rotting under communism, Finland was forced to compete. They had to play a double game. Western quality with Eastern volume. This constant high-wire act created a nation of pragmatists who knew exactly how to navigate between giants. Finlandization is often used today as a dirty word, a synonym for appeasement and cowardice. But history tells a different story. It was not cowardice. It was the ultimate act of realpolitik. The Finns understood a truth that many idealists ignore. Sovereignty is not a binary switch. It is a spectrum. Sometimes, you have to trade a percentage of your independence to preserve the existence of your nation. They swallowed their pride. They censored their newspapers. They drank vodka with dictators. They did all of this to ensure that when the Soviet Union finally collapsed, Finland would still be standing there to watch it fall. In the end, the bear died. But the walker on the tightrope survived. And perhaps that is the most important lesson of the economic Cold War. Victory isn't always about defeating the enemy in battle. Sometimes, victory is simply living long enough to see the world change. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the times. Because when history is written, you'll want to be among the few who recognized what was coming early. Thank you for watching and being part of the journey.